All right, to get us started this morning, I'm going to talk about the birds and not the eagles. I know, a lot of you, the birds, as soon as you say the birds, you think of the eagles, especially those of you who were born in the 70s or beyond, because you don't know that the Birds were a rock and roll band. They're famous for a number of songs that you probably have heard on the radio, one of which came from their record title, Turn, 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 and this is their number 4 most famous song that they wrote and that they sang. Turn, 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 and so the lyrics are, to everything, turn, turn, turn. There's a season, turn, 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 and a time to every purpose under heaven. The lyrics continue to say there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to laugh, a time to weep. And the song goes on and on and on. And if the lyrics sounded all familiar because you're somebody who reads the Bible and have perhaps read the book of Ecclesiastes, and you say, those lyrics sound familiar like they came from the Bible, that's in fact where they came from. The entire song comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, with the exception of 6 words that were added to the song. But I bring this up to just kind of talk about the reality that there are seasons in life, right? There are times for certain things, and those things, they begin, they start, and they come to an end. So there's a season for baseball, right? It starts in the spring, right? We call it spring training. Right? It usually starts sometime around March, and then we go through the season, and it ends, as it just did this past week, with the Texas Rangers winning the World Series, right? There's a time, there's a beginning, there's an end. Ninth grade, there's a beginning to ninth grade, and fortunately, there's an end to ninth grade, right? Anybody who ever went through ninth grade is grateful they got through their freshman year, or freshman year in college. It's the same kind of thing. There's a season, right? There's a time that things begin, there's a time to end. Now, when we think more deeply and more seriously, as the song says in the very first line here, there's a time to be born and a time to die. Now that line kind of strikes something a little bit deeper within us as we think about the reality of that. Thinking about birth is wonderful, right? A new baby who's born into this world. But then death is very sober and a whole lot of grief and pain that comes with it. And so the writer of Ecclesiastes says there's a time in which we're born and there's a time in which we die. And most of us, we don't like to think about that at all, right? We generally don't spend too much time thinking about that. Until maybe when we get into our 40s, 50s, or 60s. As we enter that stage of life, we do think more about it. When we're 12 or 6 or 26, that's so far into the distant. There's so many exciting things in front of us that death is something that we really don't think too much about. But when we get to the 40s, 50s, or 60s, we start to think about it a lot more. And some of the reason we begin to think about it a lot more is because it's around that time that our father dies. And so we have to walk through that grief, losing our father, and that brings a new season for us as people. It also brings a new season for our mother, who now must go on living all alone. And she navigates life as a widow and what it means to be a widow. And that also then brings us into a new season in life, in which we now have to think about what now is my role in caring for my mother now that my father is gone. So I'm 55 years old, and I definitely am in that season in which I think a lot more about death. And I'm also in this place in life where, because my father has died, I've entered a new season and having to think about what does it look like for me to help care for my mother who's now living alone. So this is the big question that we're going to be looking at this morning is, what does it look like for me to care for my mother when my father is gone? And we're going to expand the conversation and say, not only to think about that, but to also think about what does it look like for a church, for those of us who are part of a church, to care for a man or a woman who loses his husband or wife who is a part of our church. How do we do that? What are we supposed to do in that? Well, Paul addresses that topic as he's talking to young Timothy. There was the reality 2,000 years ago in which people were born and then they died, just like today. And there was a reality that there were widows living within the church, and they needed to be cared for. And there were widows living in the context of people's immediate families, and they needed to be cared for. And so Paul writes to Timothy and says, Timothy, you are the leader of the church of Ephesus. There are things that you need to understand and know and give leadership to. And a significant and important one is to address the issue of women who are now living life alone. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Now, some of us don't want to think about this. We don't want to talk about this. And the reality is that it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, right? It's because it's emotionally, it hurts. Death is ugly. And having to live life after somebody dies is difficult. It also forces us to think about our own mortality. And we don't, as people, want to do that. So we tend not to. And so you may be here this morning and already like, I'm just shutting down. I don't want anything to do with this conversation. And I encourage you to not do that. Don't do that. But let's engage this. Some of you may be in your teens, and it's like, this is so far out in the distance. But hopefully that as we look at what Paul says to Timothy, what God has to say to us, that something settles in your mind now as a young teen. So that you begin to think about when you eventually, in a couple decades, which is so far out there, might think about your responsibility. For those of you who are now in this season of life, of maybe getting to your late 30s into your 40s, and you can see this coming, hopefully this message will begin to give you some ideas of things that you can, maybe, and should be doing. And for those of you who've already walked through this, you probably should come up and talk about that. Offer your wisdom and insight to the rest of us within the church. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're going to look at verse 1 to 16. And I'm just going to kind of go slowly through this passage, pausing, explaining different words and different themes, and draw out a point at a time as we go verse by verse through this passage, and trying to understand, what is my responsibility? What am I supposed to do now that my father is gone? How am I supposed to care for my mom? And so this is what Paul writes to Timothy. He says this. He says, Timothy, in the church, you're going to have all kinds of people, and some of them are going to be older. And these older men will need to be corrected occasionally. So he says this, don't rebuke an older man harshly. And those two words, rebuke and harshly, is one word in the original language. And that word means to strike out. It's verbal striking out. It's demeaning and harsh language. And Paul says to Timothy, don't use demeaning and harsh language as you talk to older men. You are a young man. Be respectful. Yes, there may be something out of line and something that needs to be discussed. And yes, it's your responsibility as the leader to approach and to deal with the item. But don't do it harshly, but do it in an encouraging way. Exhort him, that's what that word means. It means to encourage. Exhort, it almost, in the English, it has a sense of direct and harshness to it. And it really, in the Greek, it has a softer tone to it. It's to encourage him, as if this man is your father. And then he says to treat younger men as if they're your brothers. You're in the same family, and how do you deal with conflict, and how do you do life together with the highs and the lows? And then he says to treat older women as mothers. Honor and respect and interact with them. The older women who are here, who are a part of Hope Community Church, treat all of them as though they're your very mother, with respect. And then with younger women, treat them as sisters. And then he uses this phrase with absolute, which means every kind, in every kind of way, purity. Treat younger women as sisters. They're your sister with every kind of moral purity. It's the same word that he used up in verse 12 to talk to Timothy about the kind of character that he's supposed to have as a young leader. Definitely there's a sexual piece to this, treating younger women with sexual purity in our mind as well as in our interactions with them, but it goes beyond just that. So when you read this paragraph, the sense that you get is that Paul is saying to Timothy, hey, the people who are part of the church, we're a family. We're a family. Now, that can be a negative thing for some of us because we've had broken families. We've had poor fathers. We've had destructive mothers. We've had a brother or a sister who's been incredibly difficult. And so the imagery could be negative. But it's an illustration, and it's intended to be a positive one in which a family is this loving, supportive place where you're known, you can be yourself, where when you fall short, we come alongside each other. We cheer each other on. We pick each other up. We extend grace and forgiveness, mercy, patience, gentleness, love, right? This is the picture of a right family, a righteous family. And this is the kind of picture that Timothy is saying that we are to have as we, the church, Hope Community Church, as we apply it. This local context obviously is the Ephesians church, but Hope Community Church, we're family. Now you think about that, how well do we know each other? Well, obviously we can't know everybody. I mean, it's a pretty big family. I mean, I have a big family having 6 children. You know, it's a big family. And then we got kids that have gotten married. And so now we have spouses who are a part of our children. And then they're having children. And so now we got grandkids and our family is growing. And it's awesome. It's wonderful that there's, a whole bunch of people sitting around the table now. But it ain't a couple hundred people like Hope Community Church, right? But we still have this challenge, this invitation, this expectation that the way that we interact with each other is to be familial. And that kind of changes things, doesn't it? When you walk in and you walk out, do you just walk in and walk out of the house as you walk past your mother, your father, your brother, your sister and not say anything? Do you just walk in and walk out and not look at them in the eye? And do you just disregard them? If they need some help, do you just not do anything about that? If you do need help, don't you usually say something? Like, think about all the implications if we really treat each other like a family. And so Paul's instruction to Timothy is, hey, you're a big old family, be a family. And from there, he then pivots to talk about family members who have incredible needs because They're walking through grief, and they're living life alone. And so this is what he then says in verse 3. He says, give proper recognition. That's all one word. Give proper recognition. It is the idea of showing honor, but not just showing honor. It's also showing honor and doing something tangible to meet the needs of. Honor and meet the needs of those widows who are really in need, who are a part of your family, your church family. He goes on and explains a little bit more by who this widow is. He says in verse 5, the widow who is really in need and is left all alone. So this is a woman who has no children who are in her life. She's all alone. This woman who's all alone, all she can do is put her hope in God. And continuously, each night and day, she prays and asks God for help. So, cultural context, which Paul is writing to Timothy, this is life, this is reality in Roman Empire, Ephesus in the Roman Empire in 60 AD, is this. Women do not work outside of the home. There are not professions that women can have. Also, there's no such thing as Social Security, nor is there the idea of a pension or a 401k or any kind of retirement funds. There's no such thing as any kind of social welfare net. There's nothing. And so a woman who has lost her husband and has no children and who is a part of the church is a woman who has great need and no means to meet her needs. And so Paul says, she's your mom. She's your mom. See her as your mom, church, and take care of her. Have eyes to see, have ears to hear, be aware of, be on the lookout. What are her needs? And do something to meet them. Now, he goes on from here to begin to clarify what kinds of widows who are really in need. And it's interesting because he begins to pull out something here and to demonstrate or to teach that the church is not responsible to meet and to care for every widow's need. It's only the widows in the church who have a true need, and he qualifies who those women are. He describes who these women truly are. Jumping to verse 9, he says this. He says that no woman may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60. So now we get an age description. And this woman has been faithful to her husband. So now he begins to qualify some character of her. She's well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. Doing good things. So, the church, he's saying, the church, apparently the church at Ephesus had a lot of widows. So many widows that the church was struggling to meet the need of all of them. And Paul is saying, look, we have to address the situation. And so here's what we're going to do. We are going to, Timothy, you are going to structure the ministry in such a way to meet the highest needs, the most significant needs. And those are women who are over 60 years old and have no means to defend and protect themselves. They have no family who can help them. So they have this list, these women, and they have these certain character qualities. Therefore, if there's a widow who fits outside of that, the church is not responsible to meet her needs. And he goes on and he begins to explain who that woman looks like. He says this in verse 11. He says, as for younger widows, don't put them on a list. So if you're a younger widow, you don't get on the list. For when their sensual desires, which has the sense of sexual desires, but not just sexual desires, but also just the desires of living out comfortable life. For when their sensual desires are overcome, when they overcome their dedication to Christ, and there's a sense here in which these women have made a pledge to God. Okay, their husband is gone, and they have made some kind of pledge, some kind of vow. They've said something that, we'll do this, I'll invest my life in this way now that I'm a single woman. And he's saying that there's these widows who dedicated themselves, but then they kind of go on in life and they meet a nice guy and they want to get married. And now they're going to have to break their pledge. So that's a problem. They break the pledge, they bring judgment on themselves. They're not following through with their commitment because they have broken their pledge. Besides, and here's another issue with these younger widows, they get in the habit of being idle, being lazy, not doing much, and going from house to house, sending texts and getting on Facebook and just kind of communicating with all the other women out there, and they are passing on all kinds of information and gossip and things they're learning about this friend over here, and they're sharing it with that friend over there. And they're getting involved in people's lives, they're busybodies and they're meddlers. Now you read something like this and you go, wait a minute, man, what are you saying? You're saying younger widows are all like this? No, that's not what Paul is saying. What Paul is describing is a situation in the culture, a situation in the church. There are some women in the church who, because they are younger, they have more time on their hands, and as they are grieving, they're looking for places to connect, and they fall into the trap of doing things that are wrong. Older widows can do the same thing. Younger men can do the same thing. Older men can do the same thing. It's not just younger widows. It's that in this case, there are younger widows who are part of the church of Ephesus, and this is a problem. And so Paul says, look, Timothy, lead the church in such a way as to not take care of those women. Instead, teach them to do this. And so you jump down to verse 14. He says, this is my counsel to those younger widows. He says, tell them to do this. Tell them to find a good man and to get married. Have children, manage their homes, and not give the enemy any opportunity for slander. As in fact, some already have done, and they've turned away and are following Satan. So you see how this is a very specific situation. This is a problem in the church of Ephesus that Paul is saying, address. You don't take care of all widows. These kinds of widows, you don't. Instead, the best thing to do is encourage these widows to get married. So let's just pause and say, okay, so here's the teaching, right? The teaching is the church is a family. Secondly, the teaching is that because the church is a family and there's widows within the church has the responsibility of caring for those widows. And then the third teaching is that you don't have to take care of all the widows. There are some widows that you shouldn't be taking care of. They need to be taken care of in other ways. That's the teaching. How does that apply to us? And what does it mean to us? Well, here we are as Hope Community Church, and in the past 3 years, we have 5 women whose husbands have died, and we have 2 men whose wives have died. So there's 7 widows and widowers in the past 3 years who are part of our congregation. Now, some of them have greater needs than others, but certainly each one of them are walking through challenges in life. And Paul says that we're a family. And as a family, we need to take care of each other. Now, one of the things that I just think is really awesome about us as a church is we're doing that. We're doing that. Some of you may not know, many of you are aware, there's a ministry called Hope Helps. Hope Helps was started to do this because of this. And so there's a number of you who are a part of Hope Helps. There's, I think, somewhere between 15 and 20 men and women who are on a list to help out, to meet the needs of widows and widowers and single moms who are part of our church. And to even be externally focused, so we take this even a step further, and to meet the needs of widows and widowers in our community, or single moms who are within our community that we come across with, to meet their needs. This is a wonderful thing. Now, you maybe you're sitting here and you're like, I never heard of Hope Helps, and Spirit of God is talking to me right now as I'm reading and hearing what He says is my responsibility as being a part of this church to care for. And you're just hearing about this ministry, and you're saying, hey, I can do something. Whatever that something is, I can help. Let us know that. How you can do that is you can just text the church office. All right? So this is a new feature that we now have. You can text the church. All right? This goes directly to the church office, 717-653-7168. You're here right now. You got your phone, and maybe you're thinking about this. Text us. All right? Now, nobody's going to respond until Monday. All right? So it's not like your personal phone, because we're not carrying around personal phones to deal with. The hundreds of you who are going to text in right now and tell us that you want to be a part of Hope Helps, and I hope a lot of you do. Secondly, there is a widow who's a part of our church who is actually in need. And we have a very real need where we need you, we need us to step up and to meet it. Friday, November the 17th, Rhonda Garnes, is packing all of her belongings and she's leaving the area. So her husband, John, died back in the spring. John and Rhonda have been here in this community, a part of our church for decades. And with the death of her husband, she is now planning to return to family, sisters and cousins, and so she needs to get her trailer packed up. Now, Hope Helps has been texting, and even though we have 20 people, there's only a few that are available. It's a Friday morning. Some of you maybe would be available that Friday morning, and if you would just text this and let us know, that'd be great. Or you can see Chris Hoffman, for those of you who know Chris, and just tell him directly, because Chris is giving leadership to this. All right? So this is a very, very practical way for us to live out what it is that Paul says to Timothy. This is what God says that we're supposed to be doing as a church. And we can do it. Now, if for those of you who are reading along in your paper copy or your own electronic version of 1 Timothy 5, you probably noticed that I skipped some verses. And I did that just simply to kind of keep there's these two conversations separate, so I could focus on them separately. So the first conversation is, what does it look like for us to care for widows who are a part of our church family? The second part of the conversation is, what does it look like for you to care for your mother or your father when your mother or father dies? And this is what Paul writes to Timothy about that. He says this in verse 4. He says, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, children or grandchildren. Now, I have to say that I've read through the Bible a lot of times. I probably read 1 Timothy a lot of times. But because we've been reading through 1 Timothy through the series lots of times, I have to say this is the first time that really stuck out to me. That grandchildren have a responsibility here. It's not just the children, but it's also the grandchildren. If a widow has children or grandchildren, these children and grandchildren should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice. You say you're a follower of Jesus, you need to live it out. It's the same kind of language that James uses in James chapter 1, right? The person who looks at himself in a mirror and goes away and doesn't do anything. And then right after that, he says, religion that's pure and faultless is this. It's those that look after orphans and widows. Put your religion into practice, he says, by caring for your own family and so repaying your parents and grandparents. This is pleasing to God. And then down in verse 8, he says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith. That is a pretty strong declaration. That if you have somebody in your family and you are not meeting their needs, you are not actively doing something, you have denied the faith. It is worse than an unbeliever. And then he closes with, in verse 16, if any woman who is a believer has widows in her family, she should help them. Not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who really are in need. The idea is this. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? What did he say? Love God, love others, right? So if you're a follower of Jesus, the implication is this, that the greatest goal in life is to live a life in which you love God ultimately. He's who you love most. And secondly, love others. Part of loving others looks like making a sacrifice. As we read earlier in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus, who has the deepest love for you and for me, made a sacrifice, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. He laid down his life. He did not think of his interests only, but he thought of our interests. He made a sacrifice. And this is the implication for us. As followers of Jesus, we are called to care for the widowers within our immediate family. It's our responsibility. And yes, it hurts. It's a pain in the neck. It's difficult. It requires time. It requires money. It requires disrupting my schedule. It requires a lot of things that I don't really want to deal with. But that's what it looks like to make a sacrifice, doesn't it? I do it even though I don't want to do it. So let's just, in wrapping this all up, let's just kind of pull it together and just simply ask this question. What should I do? What do I do in light of this teaching? The very first thing, and I think I can't say this strongly enough. The very first thing that we must understand is that we have a responsibility to take care of the widows and the widowers in our family. That is our responsibility. And to shirk it is shame on us. We must embrace this. But how you do that is not dictated. It's not explained. It's not told. We're not instructed how to do it. So this now makes it even well, in some ways more complex, but in some ways very relieving too, right? So if we understand it's our responsibility to take care of our families, how do you do that? Paul doesn't say. He doesn't say you have to bring your mother to live in your house. He doesn't say what to do. He just says it's your responsibility to take care of her. He doesn't address any of the challenges, right? What if? And so here's a bunch of what ifs I wrote down. What if you have a parent who's disowned you? How do you live this out? What if you have a parent who has paranoia or dementia or other health issues? Which that's the case with my mom and Valerie's mom. What if you have a parent who lives in another state, which is the case with my wife, Valerie. Her mom lives in another state. What if you have a parent who's been manipulative, who's been abusive, who's been untrustworthy? How do you respond to that? What if you don't have you don't have the time from the standpoint of like during the day you work, but somebody's got to be there with your parent. Like my mom can't be left alone. She's just not capable. She can't do that. That would not be wise. But I have a job. My wife has a job. We have responsibility. How do you work that out? What if you have a spouse who doesn't get along with? Like how do you deal with that? Right? There's all these what ifs. Paul doesn't tell us. He doesn't give us any, and that's so often so true. So many passages in Scripture, we get this very high level instruction. This is what you must do without all the details. And this is where we need to pray and ask the Spirit of God to lead and to guide us. We need to pick up books and resources. We need to listen to each other, talk to each other. What is it that you do? How have you handled this? And know that how somebody else did it isn't necessarily the way that you have to do it. So some people might think, well, to take care of my spouse or my mother means that I have to move her in to live in my house. Well, that might work, but it might not work. Then maybe what your mom wants, it may not be what your mom wants either, but you're pushing her to do this. So it's really critical to have conversations, right? To talk with your openly talk with your mother, your father. To talk openly with your spouse. Like, how are we going to do this? It's not easy. Really quickly, let me just to tell you what we've done as a family. This is what we've done. It started with Valerie's family. Valerie's parents are older than my parents. About 8 years ago, Valerie's siblings made a decision. We need to meet several times a year to talk about how we're going to care for our family, our parents. The time her father and mother were both living. And so every 3 months, there's a meeting. This started at least 8 years ago. There's another meeting coming within the next week or so in which Valerie will be joining via Zoom call. All the rest of the siblings are living in the same area so they can get together and they can talk. And what do they do in this conversation, these meetings, is to say, okay, what's going on? What are we doing? Now, there's different siblings, they have different opinions, so they have to discuss, they have to work this out. Ultimately, what has been decided in their family is to have the mother and father move into one of the siblings' homes, and the rest of the siblings to support. Now, Valerie's father has died, and so things are a little bit different, but still the same, in that one of her sisters has her mother now living with her. And how that works out, though, is the rest of the siblings will come during the week and take mom out for dinner. So there's 3 siblings that come and do this. And then on the weekend, the one sibling who has mom all week long gets a break, and another sibling comes and gets her for the weekend. And Valerie flies out to Michigan several times a year to take that turn, to do that. And this is how her family is navigating. It's not easy. It's not easy. It's hard. Lots of conversations. There's disagreements. Definitely disagreements. There's implications to their own families, and the amount of time and energy that's required to do this, and the sacrifice that they're all making. But then they're married and they have kids and grandkids, and how do we? Just saying, it's hard. But I can say this: they're working to be responsible in caring for their mother because their father is gone. I think it's a great model. It's a great example. And I'm just beginning to navigate this. My father suddenly died in February. And my mom lives with my sister. And there's just all kinds of complications and challenges that we're having to walk through. I'm going to invite our worship team to come on up. The other thing to know is that not only does Paul not explain everything, like how it's all out, but we have this one text, right, that says, you have the responsibility to take care of your family, and if you don't, God's going to judge you. You're living wrong by not taking care of your family. But but we don't have any description about like, well, my mom is a pain in the neck, right? And she does this, this, and this, and she behaves in these ways, and it's creating this kind of tension and this kind of problems, right? One of the things that we have to remember is that when we read Scripture, we can't just read just that little bit. We have to see the whole context. And so the Bible has a lot to say about how we interact with each other, how we live life. And so if you are dealing with a parent who's incredibly difficult for X, Y, and Z and doing all these kinds of things, there's other scriptures that speak to this is how you deal with a person who's behaving in this way. So yes, you have a responsibility to care for them, but that care for them maybe has gotten more complicated. And we need to live out these other principles, which may mean that the way that you care for your family is not the way that I care for my family. It's just really complex. And so this is where we need to, as followers of Jesus, be men and women who keep digging into the Word, where we need to be connected in meaningful relationships, where we can talk about what it is that we're working through, and other people can share and give insights, where we can learn from those who are ahead of us, where we can be calling out to God in prayer and asking Him to lead and guide us and help us in making decisions, because it's hard, but it's our responsibility. It's your responsibility. We have it for the church, but also our immediate family.
Please stand and sing with us.
When darkness tries to roll over my wall, sorrow comes to steal the joy I
Your kids are watching you, right? You are teaching them there's someday that you're going to be the widow. There's someday you're going to be the widower. There's someday that you're going to have needs. And it's going to be your kids. So teach them well now. Have a great week.